All right, so for our group project, we decided to study the research on Vanuatu and effects of colonization on food security and agriculture.
So our research question that is framing this project is how has the subsistence of farming, agriculture, and food security been impacted by the British and French colonization of Vanuatu?
Okay, so food security is a really important part of our research question. So just to do a check, if you guys know what food security is, maybe you can raise your hand. Also, you might, what do you guys know about food security? You can add some quick thoughts or comments in the chat. Okay, thanks. Great ideas. So, food security, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the state of having reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. There are a number of factors that can affect food security, such as land or water availability, agrobiodiversity, which is the diversity of the plants that you're growing, climate, things like that. Vanuatu is actually one of the top 15 most vulnerable countries in the world due to its geography and placement in the Pacific Ocean. It's vulnerable to both volcanic and seismic activity year round, and because of that, they're also vulnerable to tsunamis, and also just because of their lack of coping and adapting abilities. That's one of the reasons why it's so vulnerable. Um, Food security in Vanuatu is also being affected by a growing reliance on imported goods and cash crops, but I'll elaborate more on that later on.
So Vanuatu was colonized by Great Britain and France in the 18th century, shortly after Cook's arrival to the islands. And in 1907, they established a joint administration, also known as the condominium period, which lasted until 1980, when Vanuatu gained their independence. So the island's economic and financial development was mainly influenced by France, whereas the educational and political systems were mainly dominated by Great Britain. And in Woodward's political memoir of his 25 years of active work in Vanuatu before their independence, he reminisces that there wasn't much tourism in the 1950s to the islands, with no cruise ships visiting, then considered New Hebrides. So the economy was mainly sustained by agricultural export, specifically of copra, which we'll get into a bit later. So though France held a great portion of control over the island's economic stability, there was also Australian and Chinese influence in the island's commerce. The legal status and identity of Ni Vanuatu people in the 1950s made it difficult for them to travel outside of the Southern Pacific due to their documentation not being recognizable for immigration officials. And as Woodward stated, Ni Vanuatu people could not be citizens of a state which did not exist or of a colonial territory. There was not a legal entity. The indigenous peoples were also not allowed to sit as assessors on the joint court or the courts of first instance when the Vanuatu people were being tried. So it made it hard for indigenous input to directly affect policies impacting other Native peoples on the island. And but in 1957, a temporary joint regulation called the Advisory Council, or ADCO, was established for the resident commissioners to consult important issues related to the condominium, and it consisted of 4 French, 4 British, and 4 Ni Vanuatu members. So before the 1970s, dispute over land rights and possession wasn't a huge problem that was discussed within politics, but it grew more frequent after 1970, and policing was used to deter Native peoples from owning European developed land, and continued to be a growing issue until Vanuatu gained its independence. And all land previously controlled by non-Indigenous people was given back to the Ni Vanuatu. it's also important to note that though interaction was mainly somewhat peaceful, relatively peaceful between the European settlers and the indigenous people of Vanuatu, the history, especially in the early times of the condominium period, violence and brutal killings should not be forgotten.
So in Vanuatu, especially in the past, many people lived in rural villages. So more than 75% of Vanuatu's economy is involved in agriculture, especially the population. So this leads to small-scale farming within these communities. Some crops that are included in these communities are taro, yams, kamara, bananas, coconut, and a variety of vegetables and fruits. The most important export of Vanuatu has been copra, which is dried coconut kernel. However, since the 1990s, the price has dropped, making it not as profitable as it once was before. The Commonwealth Development Corporation has set up large scale plantations of Arabica coffee on Tana Island and cocoa on Malakua Island. However, these places have since been abandoned due to the drop in the market. There's also been exploitation of the forest on Vanuatu in 1826 when a explorer ex-trader discovered the valuable sandalwood on the island Erromango. Uh, they are all, Vanuatu is surrounded by water, making it fishing be very popular there due to the various species that live in the water. This has made the Japanese and Chinese try to set up bases to transfer these kinds of foods to their own countries. However, this also makes the local fish market struggle. There is also a narcotic called kava, or the technical name Piper mesticum, which is a shrub plant and a traditional mildly narcotic drink. It has pharmaceutical values that islanders have believed in for centuries, and it rose in popularity in Europe and other countries around the world. However, it soon fell when a German study discovered that it has liver damage effects to the person who takes it. This has caused the sale of kava to go down as it is banned in the US and Europe.
So, as Molly was saying before, Vanuatu is primarily agricultural, and increasingly because of colonial influence and globalization, the economy has become increasingly reliant on cash crops. So, cash crops are crops that are grown for the primary purpose of exportation to other countries. And in Vanuatu, the main ones are cocoa, kava, coffee, and coconut. The increased reliance on these crops has had a direct impact on the local diet. So this has been noted by a study done by Vincent Labat in 2015 that this change or this increased purchase of imported foods is actually a social cultural change and not due to any food security issues. It's primarily because of changing dietary preferences and high demographic pressure. So in places where there's a larger population, there's usually also less space and less land to grow your own food, and also a greater need for more efficient and convenient ways to get food. This has led to a lot of health effects, such as increased obesity and malnutrition, that actually affects a lot of the Pacific. Another effect of cash crop reliance is it actually increases the community's exposure and vulnerability to external shocks. So perennial cash crops are especially vulnerable to tropical depressions and changes in the weather or the climate. So a bad winter or climate change can lead to a great loss of profits. And also the Vanuatu economy becomes more vulnerable to changes in international prices. So, for example, as Molly was saying, copra used to be a primary cash crop of Vanuatu, but due to the drop in prices, that is no longer very profitable. Another effect of cash crop reliance is that it decreases the availability of land and time that can be used for growing subsistence food crops such as bananas, yams, and taro. And these are foods that were historically used or eaten in Vanuatu, and due to the reliance on cash crops are increasingly or decreasingly being consumed.
So in Vanuatu, small-scale farmers rely heavily on the sustainability of their crops. As Sophia said, cash crops are very important to Vanuatu. However, this has led to a loss in biodiversity due to the soil being overly used to the nutrients being lost. This also is because of foreign countries planting their own crops that they needed, such as sweet potatoes or other crops, which leads to invasive species on Vanuatu. However, recent studies have also shown new crops are being used by farmers to strengthen the resilience of their agrosystems, having the crops neither being compromised or drastically changed in agricultural diversity so lately.
So for another Zoom engaging activity, are there any similar situations of food security or food insecurity that you know of, maybe in the Pacific? And what kinds of initiatives have been taken to address these problems? If you would, please post your responses in chat or raise your hand. Thank you. So to go into more of the migration and diasporic connections, and then to relate them to what we learned in this course, there was the migration and relocation of the Tonkinese indentured workers who originated from Indo-Chinese provinces, and they worked on French plantations and had a great impact on not only relieving the lack of labor available for those plantations, but also in boosting Vanuatu's economy. And then by the early 1950s, many of these workers left the plantations for other opportunities because they had already assimilated into life on Vanuatu, several having been born on the island. So when North Vietnam became independent in 1963, and their return home was delayed, many of them were reluctant to go back to Vietnam and felt no attachment remaining in then considered new Hebrides. There was also a small group of Ni Vanuatu people from the peri-urban islands, not the outer islands, but closer to the capital, like Pentecost at Tebecor, north of Port Vila, who were moved to Taga Bay because of land instability and religious connections to churches. And these situations strongly connect to the unit on migration and diasporic connection because covered in this course, because not only have Ni Vanuatu peoples faced problems with adjustment and relocation, but also the indentured workers that were brought to the island to help sustain the economy were experiencing inter-island displacement and also face struggles with adaptation.
All right, so since Vanuatu is located along the shallow coast, it is vulnerable to rising sea levels and the increasing tropical storms that have been hitting due to climate change. And since 2005, Pacific Islanders have been forced off their smaller islands onto larger islands such as Fiji. This puts them in an unfamiliar environment, making it hard for them to integrate into society, which leads to the problems that were recently stated. Natural disasters also occur, which is beyond the people's control, and these destroy their crops. A recent cyclone, such as Pam in March of 2015, destroyed 90% of buildings in Vanuatu, in addition to 64.1% of their GDP being affected due to most of their crops being destroyed or damaged. However, there's also many developing businesses in Vanuatu, as foreign investors come to seek tourism, financial services, land development, and crop plantations. For example, in 1860, cotton plantations really boomed when Europeans established their place in Vanuatu. And since then, conflicts between the Vanuatu people and the natives and foreigners have arisen in conflict.
Emilio David Saracere is from Vanuatu and is part of the Yam tribe. He works at the Vanuatu Indigenous Land Defense Desk at the Vanuatu Cultural Center. His program's mission is to protect, preserve, and promote Vanuatu's traditional identities. One way he can do this is through the land in Vanuatu. As Molly talked about, there's a land boom and tourism boom in Vanuatu in the early 2000s. The development of formal systems of land registration led to many Indigenous people being displaced from their homes and land grabbers, as Amino calls them, to take more land. He states, land is the foundation of everything that's connected to food, traditional knowledge, and custom beliefs. It's the power base of society. Without land, Indigenous people are forced to conform to Western ways of thinking, which has contributed to the loss of culture. Factors like the cash economy, church ideology, and education system all being introduced make it difficult for the Indigenous people to follow their original traditions. One way Vanuatu is trying to address these problems is through a program called the Christensen Fund. Amino believes the main way to maintain the culture is to preserve the traditional knowledge and lifestyle of Ni Vanuatuan people. And the best way to do this is through the land that they have. And one way Vanuatu is working to preserve their culture is through the food, specifically the slow food movement. This is a process of being able to access and enjoy food that is good for them, good for the ones who grow it, and good for the planet. And this video is a minute long and explains a little bit more about the slow food movement in Vanuatu and how effective it can be. From the past to now, land distribution, diasporic migration, and agricultural practices established during the 18th century have had lasting effects on food security and insecurity within Vanuatu.
So in Vanuatu, there has been many globalization and land conflicts rising over the years. However, globalization is really useful to Vanuatu as it makes it more open to the world as they can sell their crops in markets, helping them more urbanize the place. However, land loss is very important as natives are losing their land that is important to their ancestors, and this makes for people to gain more money for their own benefit, as you can see from the colonization over the past years. Here's our references, and that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for coming.